Now, the person who get hold of this hashtag that you have created, how can the person use it? How do you want it to be helpful to the people who finds it?
Yeah, for people who find it, I want it to be helpful in that one, they can just be a spectator, right? And look at it and learn some more about Black history, maybe a little known fact or a deeper kind of treatment of something that happened in Black history that they already knew about. But also, if they travel to certain places, that they can not only seek out these places, monuments to Black history, or museums that treat Black history in a certain way, but also I will throw in restaurants and businesses where they can get a taste of Black culture, of African descended people's culture, of African people's culture. So a person who is Ethiopian, right, may not, if even if they're living in America, even if they're born and reared in America, may not self-identify as African American, may or may not, but this is an African country. And so sometimes you'll see me and I'm like, okay, when you're in Denver, Colorado, try this Ethiopian restaurant. It's really good. And this is, what you might want to know about the history of Ethiopians in the United States, or the like, right? So it's kind of pragmatic in that way. So even if you're not interested in history, you're one of those people who are like, yeah, that was 100 years ago. That was 500 years ago. What does that have to do with me? If you want to support Black owned businesses, if you want to learn more about the continent of Africa, African peoples, and the African diaspora, then you can follow Black History Bucket List and get that information.
That's lovely. I love that so much because here we pay a lot of attention to African diaspora. Our money, we're not talking about money today. in that the money in the African diaspora, there are people that hate the African diaspora, that hate the African people, but they never hate the money.
Mm.
So, so here I've said it a number of times that we should look for a way to control our money so that we can also develop our community. That is very important. So we don't need to be ashamed to say buy
Right.
African businesses, promote your fellow African businesses wherever you are. That is very, very important. All right, now the term black history, African history. I think this is something that you have repeatedly used here a couple of times in your explanation so far. You want to make a clarification? Is one in the place of other? Are they exactly the same thing? Help me understand it because probably there are some people who don't really understand it in detail. Please help us. You are a historian.
Right. Yeah. Because some of these terms are so vague, right? So Black can mean, in one context, people who are African descended, and then, the person who is of the Indian diaspora, right, from India, their grandparents were from India, will say, well, you know what, my folks were Kenyan. So, it can be complex, right? So in a lot of ways, I use Black as a synonym for African American. And in particular, sometimes for the most part, I use Black as a synonym for African Americans who are descended from people who were enslaved during the period of chattel slavery in the British North American colonies in the United States. So like 1619 to 1865. But I also I see and teach the commonalities between people who are African descended and whose ancestors or whose family members were scattered throughout the world somewhere else besides the African continent. So African diaspora can be broadly defined. Some historians say there are 5 African diasporas, and the first one deals with early migrations, human migrations out of Africa from prehistoric times, and then say that the modern African diasporas are number 4 and 5. And so the 4th African diaspora has to do with the transatlantic slave trade. And then the 5th African diaspora takes up during the period after the transatlantic slave trade is over, and has to do with people who migrate outside of the continent for various and sundry reasons, including to find work or to flee, civil war and famine. And that 5th African diaspora is it's evolving to this very day. So I use all of that. I don't do, like I said, I don't do prehistory, but I tend to, like I said before, I include, say, for instance, Nigerian Americans and Ethiopian Americans in my definition of African diaspora. You mentioned Jamaicans, that I would also include Jamaicans of, who consider themselves mostly of African descent, because every other Jamaican that I meet has an Indian or a Chinese grandma. I always joke, right? So, I mean, same here, there's no so-called purity in my family, if there's such a thing. But I consider the commonalities that we have in terms of being members of the African diaspora. For instance, I have a classmate from Spelman College whose parents are Jamaican, but who left Jamaica and they lived for a time in England, and then they left England and they lived for a time in Canada, and then she came into the United States to attend Spelman College. And so we are sisters, of African descent who went to historically Black college together. But she may have a lot in common with, Nigerian people who settled in England, and she knows that, that part of her history. And we have so many connections, and I think I like to focus on our commonalities without ignoring our differences.
Okay. I want you to say one more thing regarding this Black and African. Is it like maybe a kind of, when you use white to describe some European, and therefore European are white and white instead of European, in this case, Black for Africans are Black, so you use Black instead of Africa. Is that in that context? So I'm trying to understand if it is possible that we use Africa instead of Black. When we say Black, we are referring to Africa. When we say white, we are referring to European. So I'm trying to understand where is it coming from? If you can give me more background on that. Okay. What I'm trying to say is that if you organize a meeting in West Africa, Ghanaian, Nigeria, Senegalese, Ivorian, those terms, Black is not going to come out in our discussion. Okay, if we organize another meeting, US, okay, not US this case, because US is already in contest, say UK, Canada, Nigeria, and Congo, okay, maybe it might come out, no? So I'm trying to understand if it really relevant way to use Black for Africa, white for European, or is it because it's easier for us to understand?
Yeah, it's just shorthand. It's definitely not perfect. I'm not claiming that it's a perfect designation. And, I'm really upfront about my positionality, right? So I told everybody I'm a child of the United States South, where, race is front and center and so much in terms of our identities and our everyday lives. And this idea of me being a Black person was definitely incubated in Alabama in the United States. So to explain to you how much I understand what you're talking about. So I grew up, I was born at a time when Black was the designation for people with my heritage. And about in the 1980s, the assertion, late 1980s, early 1990s, it was asserted that Black was not descriptive enough, particularly in terms of expressing our pride in our African heritage, which is a very important assertion that began with my parents' generation and was kind of taken to new heights with my generation. And to give you some context, like, if you found the wedding pictures of my parents, they're standing, they have painted my grandparents' patio white and put a Black outline of the continent of Africa in the middle, and they're standing on that to get married. Like, it's important for them to get married on a map of Africa. Whereas if you talk to my grandmother, she's alive to this day, 94 years old, she'll still say, no, we're not African. No, we're not African. That's not what they were taught. They don't think that about themselves. She'll say, oh, well, people used to say daddy's daddy, which would be my great great grandfather, might have been from Africa, but he was a wanderer and we don't really know. So they don't, her generation does not consider themselves people of African descent at all. And they really harbored a lot of the negative stereotypes that they were getting from the media about Africa and African people. So there's like a sea change in terms of how we defined ourselves and felt about ourselves and our heritage. In particular, then it became hard to deny, with the advent of DNA, right, science, that we were of African descent. So I began to self-identify in the late 80s, early 90s as an African American.